Hello, hi, welcome. So summer is nearly at an end. We've reached September and we are finally entering the fall season and I am so excited about it. But before we officially get into fall, I wanted to give you all a wrap up of the books I read over the summer because I read a decent amount of books this summer, which was really nice. And I wanted to be able to give you all reviews of everything I've read over the past several months. So these are basically all the books I've read since June when I made my mid-year book freakout tag video. And it's a pretty good number. I actually haven't counted, so I don't know how many books I read, but it's quite a bit and I'm pretty happy and pleased with myself. And I had a really good reading summer. I read so many books that I absolutely loved, some new all-time favorites, some that I didn't love so much, but nonetheless, I'm very excited to get into all of them. Really quickly, before we get into all the books, I want to remind you all that my bracelet that I designed with Anna Luisa is linked in the description box below as always if you'd like to check it out, as is my reading journal, the Clockwork Reader reading journal, so be sure to check both of these out in the description box below. All right, now without any further ado, let's talk about all the books I read this summer. So starting off, we have a book that I'm really excited to talk about because I loved this. Like, this was 5 stars, so enjoyable for me, and that is A Far Wilder Magic by Alison Saft. This is a YA fantasy novel where the magic system is based in alchemy, and it is definitely inspired by Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. And if you know me at all, you know that that's like one of my favorite anime of all time, just one of my favorite shows of all time in general. I've seen it so many times. I love Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and this is very much inspired by that. So the chances of me liking this were very high. And when I started it, I did not know that. I literally just picked this up because I thought the cover was really pretty, but I had no idea what it was about. And then, to make things even better, not only is it inspired by Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, I've mentioned this now in like one other video, but I fully believe with my whole heart and soul that this book is essentially a fanfic of Roy and Riza from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, but like their early life, like when they were young, the stuff that's like not in the show. And I love Roy and Riza. They are like one of my favorite ships of all time. All time. I've read so much fan fiction about them. It's an alarming amount of fan fiction, but I've read so much of it, okay? So I know my Roy and Riza fic, and I promise you, this is heavily influenced, heavily inspired by, or written by a person who also really knows their Roy and Riza fic, because I can tell you the fan fiction that I think this one is inspired by, or like the headcanons and stuff that are in here, the tropes and things that are in here between these two characters are just such common tropes in the fandom for this ship specifically, and like there's no way it's not. And I fully mean this as a compliment. I'm not trying to say that it felt fanficky and like super tropey. I'm saying that like I see it because I know, and anyone who knows, anyone who's read Roy and Riza fic, anyone who's like super into the Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood fandom, specifically with those two characters, you'll easily know, and it is such a good time. It's so much fun to read. It is obviously different, and I don't want to dissuade anybody who isn't interested in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood or Roy and Riza from reading this book. If you don't know anything about them, this is not one of those situations where it's like, oh, the characters are really, really bland because they're supposed to be these two characters, so you feel like something's missing if you read it. If you don't know anything about them, if you don't know anything about that world or don't care at all, I think you'll still enjoy this. It really stands on its own as its own story as well. However, I just want to like clarify that I think the reason I like it so much is because of that specifically, because I can associate it with those characters, and that just made my reading experience all the more enjoyable. So if you're like, I don't care about Roy and Riza, I don't care about Full Metal Alchemist, I don't know anything about those things, will I still like this book? Yes, I think you could still like this book if you like quiet, like low fantasy books. I think you'll definitely enjoy this. It's not like super high stakes or really intense. If you're more of like a character development than a plot development type of person, I definitely think you'll enjoy this. I think the author is a great writer as well. Sometimes in fantasy books it can be kind of difficult to understand what's going on a lot of the time, but personally with her writing I found it to be very clear. If you're looking for a good YA fantasy standalone novel, I highly recommend. If you want something that kind of has Sorcery of Thorns vibes, that type of like these two characters meet and they have to go on some kind of like adventure or accomplish some kind of mission or something together, this will definitely be up your alley. Plus, if you love Roy and Riza, if you like Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood at all, just read it. Read it. Oh my god, this was 5 stars for me. I loved it. It was so enjoyable. Highly recommend. The next books that I read were all of the books that I read in my I read 5 more romance books video, so I'm not going to go through them in much detail. I'm basically just going to mention them. If you want to hear more details about my thoughts on them, you can go and watch that video. But the first book I read for that video was 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. I really loved this and I gave this 4 to like 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read a new all-time favorite, which was The Charm Offensive, and I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. This is like my new favorite romance book. If you want to read a really great romance book, in my opinion, this is my #1 recommendation. Highly, highly recommend. Please read it. It's so good. Next, I read Book Lovers by Emily Henry, another one I really enjoyed. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Delilah Green Doesn't Care by Ashley Herring Blake. This one I didn't love too much. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It wasn't bad by any means, but it just wasn't really my thing. And then lastly, I read A Lady for a Duke by Alexis Hall, and this is a historical romance novel, and I loved it. This was another 4.5, I think, out of 5 stars. Really, really enjoyed it. Highly recommend as well. All right, so the next book that I read this summer was Juniper and Thorn by Ava Reid. I loved this. Like, absolutely loved this. I read Ava Reid's other book earlier this year, which was The Wolf and the Woodsman, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really good, and I was really excited to pick this one up because it was her new release for this year, and I'm so glad I did. I don't know how to explain, like, I can't stop thinking about this. I think I read this in July, and it's like still stuck with me. I think about it a lot. I did mark up a lot of the pages. I don't think you can see that very well on camera, but like, oh my god, I'm obsessed. This is a gothic retelling of the story of the juniper tree, and I honestly don't know anything about the story of the juniper tree. I do want to read it now since I've read this and I enjoyed it, so I'd like to know all the references and everything, but I honestly didn't know anything about it. Didn't know anything about the premise of this. I just knew that it was like gothic horror and definitely going to be a bit disturbing, and it absolutely is. But basically the book follows the story of these 3 sisters who are witches, and they live with their abusive, manipulative father. And Marlenchen, the youngest sister, is our main character whom we follow as she and her sisters sneak out one night to go to this ballet performance where she meets one of the dancers there, and there's like a bit of a romance in it as well, but the whole story doesn't necessarily all revolve around the romance. There's definitely a lot more to it. I would say the main themes of the story are more about like familial relationships and abuse and power, and it was just fantastic. It was really disturbing. I definitely want to preface it with that. It was really dark and really disturbing. It's gothic horror. You're gonna have horror elements in this. The descriptions of the events that happen, of even some like really small details, are just really grotesque and disgusting at times, but it all like is obviously very relevant to the story, and it adds a lot to the atmosphere of the story, and obviously that comes with the genre. There were definitely, like I mentioned, themes of abuse in here. There's a lot of graphic imagery in here as well, so some things are very graphic, so definitely just look up content warnings if you decide to read the book. But personally, like, I don't know how to explain why I loved this so much. I think I just found Marlenchen and just all of the characters in general to be like a bit different from what I typically see in like standalone fantasy romance books, and this isn't really a fantasy romance, obviously. It's more gothic horror, like I said, but Marlenchen was just so different. She was messy, and she made a lot of mistakes. She was always trying her best, and she was also a survivor of like severe abuse, and just seeing somebody who has experienced that get to be just who they are and make the mistakes that they make without being judged was so nice, despite the fact that there are definitely characters in the book that do judge her and are cruel and mean to her. From the author's perspective, I felt like the author wasn't judging her, and the author was just letting her be who she was and letting her be as messy as she needed to be, and I loved that. I loved the characterization in this book. Every single one of the characters I felt like was very well fleshed out, and I feel like the message for the book just came across very clearly without being like too in your face. It was still subtle. You could tell what the author was trying to say. You didn't need any sugarcoating or spoon feeding. Like, you clearly got the message through her extremely descriptive, extremely beautiful, disturbing writing and characterization of these characters and development of this plot. Like, it was just, I don't know how to explain it. I feel like this is just the type of thing that you have to read for yourself and experience on your own. But I personally just absolutely loved this. When I first finished it, I was like, that was really, really good. And I think I gave it like 4 or 4.5 out of 5 stars. And then I just kept thinking about it, and I was like, no, you know what? I loved this. This is a 5-star book for me, and I'm so happy I read it. Again, please be sure to look up content warnings if you decide to read it. I want to emphasize that it is extremely disturbing at times. Extremely disturbing. However, in my opinion, absolutely worth it. So great. And now I just want to read every gothic horror, gothic romance, whatever novel I can find because I love this genre. All right, the next book that I read was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is a classic, very well known, obviously, but as you can tell, I was still in like a gothic mood, so that's why I picked this up. I also picked this up because there are so many references to Jekyll and Hyde in pop culture in general, and while I've understood like the base of the references a lot of the time, I wanted to know like the full context of the story story. So that was another reason I decided to read this, and I'm glad I did. Personally, I didn't love it. I listened to this one on audiobook, and while I actually enjoyed the narrator, I just felt a bit disconnected from it for some reason. I feel like I'd have to read it again in like a physical book, and maybe I would enjoy it a little bit more, but personally, I just didn't love it. I think I was expecting to really love this, and I ended up rating it a 3 out of 5 stars. I thought it was good in some ways, and in other ways, I was honestly a little bit bored from time to time. It's definitely more of a type of book that I feel like I would benefit from a bit more if I were to read it for a class, or if I were to read it with like a group of people and we could discuss it. But other than that, it's very short. I don't know, I wasn't thrilled by this the way that I was expecting to be, so it was just okay. All right, the next book that I read is now also another all-time favorite. Like I mentioned, I read a lot of really great books this summer, and this is potentially number 1. I don't even know. I can't decide. However, I'm obsessed with this book, and that is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. If you know me at all, you know I don't really like dystopian novels. I like The Hunger Games, and I like Scythe as well for like a newer-ish YA dystopian. But in terms of more like major dystopian books, I haven't read The Handmaid's Tale, but I'm not a fan of 1984, and I just don't like the majority of the genre. I have a lot of problems with it in general. However, this book, it's everything. It is one of the best things I've ever read in my entire life. I finished it and I immediately texted someone. I was like, I think this might be the best book I've ever read. And I feel like that might actually be true. It's incredible. When I say I was like mesmerized reading this, I mean it. I was absolutely just immersed into the story completely. The outside world did not exist. I don't even know how to talk about it. I feel like it deserves its own video. If you happen to not know what this book is about, it is essentially a dystopian post-apocalyptic novel set in the year 2024 to like 2030, somewhere around there. It's like a long span of time. Basically, the book starts out in the year 2024, and we are living in a dystopian like future version of America. This future version of America in the book, without spoiling anything, is essentially the America we are living in today, with a few embellishments here and there, a few things that are a bit more exaggerated than the real life that we have now. However, if you really look at it, it is essentially the world we have right now. And Octavia Butler wrote this in like 1990 or something, and she fully predicted, like completely predicted, the reality of actual 2022, 2 years later. She's like 2 years off. She's either psychic or she's just extremely intelligent and looked at the patterns of history and saw what continuously happens and looked at what the reality of the world was in the 90s and predicted what it would be like eventually, because like I said, she was really smart. Our main character is this 15-year-old Black girl who is living in her neighborhood with her family. And these neighborhoods are extremely like segregated. People of the same like culture and race and religious background all kind of grouped together for protection, because there are people who come into these towns and just destroy everything, steal everything, and the government just like doesn't care about people. People are starving and dying. Homelessness is rampant. Crime is rampant. Like, it's just an extremely terrible world to be living in. And the story follows Lauren, our main character, over several years as things change in her life and she has to move from Los Angeles because she lives in Los Angeles. And all the while she has been kind of writing and journaling about this idea that she has had called Earthseed, which is essentially a religion that she creates. And like, I think that's all you really need to know. I don't think you should know anything else about it, but I can't explain what this book was like for me. It was honestly like a religious experience. There were lots of references in it to the Bible and religion in general that I personally didn't know very much about or didn't understand very much. So I think had I had that context, it would have been an even more immersive experience, and I would have gotten even more out of it. However, even without that, the different topics that she touches on about religion and her like worldview and like just view of religion in general and how to create a religion was just absolutely fascinating to me. It was just beyond anything else I've ever read. I do not know like how to explain what I felt reading this book because it was just so wonderful and so well written. I genuinely couldn't put it down and I wanted to read it again immediately after I finished it. I almost did, but I had other things I had to do so I couldn't. But I probably will read it again before the end of the year because I liked it that much and I feel like I need more than one reading to fully get everything out of this book. The main themes of the story, one of the main themes at least of the story, was about change because her religion, Earthseed, that Lauren creates, the like pinnacle of this religion, everything that it hinges on is change. She believes that God is change. For her, God is change. And the way that she talks about that, about change and growth and time, the perspective that she had on that was, it altered something in my brain. I'm so serious. And obviously it's a dystopian post-apocalyptic novel, so it's going to talk a lot about different social issues as well, like the economy, poverty, race, class, just all of these big social problems. But it was just done with so much nuance and so much thought and so much grace as well, to the point where I don't feel like I'm being preached at, and I feel like I am learning something from this, but subconsciously. Do you know what I mean? Not because the book is like telling you you should be thinking this, but because like subconsciously, like what you are taking in is forcing you to think about things differently than you might have thought about them before. And that was the first time in a while that that's happened to me while I was reading a book, specifically a fiction book. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I cannot recommend this enough. 5 out of 5 stars. I want to read the sequel. I want to read it again. I will read it again. Number 1 recommendation for me in terms of dystopian, post-apocalyptic fiction. Just read it. Read it. Literally like my number 1 recommendation for the year. I will be surprised, honestly, if it doesn't end up being my favorite book of the whole year, because that's how much I loved this. It's beyond anything else. All right, and then on a very, very different note, complete 180 here. I read The Viscount Who Loved Me, the second Bridgerton novel by Julia Quinn. I, as most of you probably know, have been super into Bridgerton this year, specifically Bridgerton season 2. I was not a fan of season 1, but I love season 2. I have watched it like 5 times at this point. Is that unhealthy? Probably. Will I watch it again? Probably. Anyway, point is, I love Bridgerton season 2, and I was like, you know what, I have to read the book because it's sitting here, I may as well read it so I can compare it to the season. I've seen it so many times. What's the harm in getting more of the same story? The harm is that this wasn't good. I unfortunately did not like this at all. There were parts of it that were definitely fun and were very similar to the show, obviously, since it is based off of it. However, personally, I find the show so much more enjoyable, so much more nuanced, so much more emotional than the book is. The things that they changed in the show, for the most part, not everything necessarily, but for the most part, personally, I really liked. I felt like it added a lot more to the characters. I felt like it added a lot more to their relationship, and the problems that the characters had with each other felt more realistic than they did in here. Nothing was really going on in this book. Also, the bee scene, that was a lot. It was a lot. It was too much, actually. It was too much, and I wasn't a fan. Hi, so I just quickly want to add that one of my biggest gripes with this was that the "you're the bane of my existence and the object of all my desires" line was not even said. Like, he doesn't even say that to her. It was narration. It was in his head. He never says those words to her. So like, what was the point? If he doesn't say that to her, what's the point? It was so lackluster compared to the show. Kate had no personality whatsoever in this book, and Anthony was just an asshole, and I didn't like it. It wasn't fun. Whereas in the show, they're both like complex and complicated, and they have their own flaws and everything, but you can still find them lovable. In this one, personally, I just found them boring and lacking and one-dimensional. So yeah, I was not very pleased with my reading experience of The Viscount Who Loved Me, unfortunately. So I'm just gonna go back to rewatching season 2 over and over and over again until season 3 comes out. All right, next up I read a book talk favorite, a book that I'd been putting off for months and months. I got this back in like February because I saw one quote and it sounded really good, and then it blew up on TikTok after that, and now it's being traditionally published, and that book is Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake. Yes, I finally read Alone with You in the Ether. I didn't love it. I don't think it was terrible. I'll just say that off the bat. I gave this like 3 out of 5 stars. It's probably like 2.75 to 3-ish, you know, like in that range. Not like bad, but I wouldn't really recommend it personally. Here's my thing with this. It is trying to do way too much all at one time, and it doesn't work. The book is trying to have like this really unique format, and sometimes it does. It definitely does have a really unique format, but that's because it's using like 7 different literary devices or whatever all at once, and also trying to have multiple different formats in one in a way that's just convoluted and pretentious. That's the best way I can describe this book. It is extremely pretentious. I don't really necessarily even mean that as like an insult. I just mean that as the literal definition of pretentious. Like, that's what the book is, which makes sense because one of the characters is a math PhD student slash professor, and the other character works at an art museum and she's an artist. So like by nature of the story and the characters, it's gonna be a bit pretentious, and that's definitely in part one of the main like themes of the story. I don't think that that was unintentional. However, it is pretentious. I did take a few notes, so I'm gonna go through most of these to try and talk about it in a more like coherent and concise way. But first, the writing was extremely dense and extremely heavy. Like it was hard to get through because you had to read every single word, otherwise you would not know what's going on. And sometimes I mean that as a compliment, because there are some books that like really just command your attention and they force you to read every single word because you really just want to know what's going to happen and you don't want to miss a thing. This was not like that. If you missed one word, you would not know who was speaking. You would not know what was going on. It just dragged. It was dense and it was heavy. The book would also go on a lot of tangents. They wouldn't finish sentences sometimes or finish thoughts. It almost felt like stream of consciousness, which is actually a writing device I really like in terms of storytelling. I think books that are written in that kind of stream of consciousness format can be really effective. However, this just felt like a bunch of like unfinished thoughts strewn together. And some of the finished thoughts were really well done, but there were too many unfinished ones. And this could be because it is self-published and it didn't have a full editor to like go through and like fully edit things out. I think this book would definitely heavily benefit from an editor, and maybe the traditionally published version will be a bit more clean and a bit less dense. However, it just truly just felt like some thoughts were just not complete. It was just missing things. Kind of like a diary entry, but like not a very clear-cut one. One when you're like in the middle of like a crisis and you're really going through it, which you could argue is kind of the point, since these characters are definitely going through a lot emotionally, mental health wise. They're not in the best place, so you could argue that. However, as far as like a reading experience goes, it was just so unclear at times and so convoluted that it was difficult to get through. So that's why I don't think it was that effective. The other thing is that the book had a very like intentional, like formulaic structure, almost as if it was like a math formula, since one of the characters is a mathematician. And so that's why I feel like that stream of consciousness kind of unfinished thought style of writing was really inconsistent with the structure of the story, and that style of prose just didn't work. Like I said, the book has like multiple different formats of storytelling. First, it starts off with some like narrators who are like random characters or people. Sometimes they are the characters in the books. It's very weird. I started reading it and I was like, oh, that's not what I was expecting. So we're gonna have like these random narrators who give us stage directions almost as if this is a play, which I thought was really unique and really cool. But after like chapter 1, that never comes back again until the very, very end, like the last page, but it's not like related to the rest of the story. And once I was like getting towards the end, I was like, when is this narrator thing gonna come back? And is it gonna tie back into the beginning? And once we got to the end, at first I was like, oh, let me go back and check, like maybe this is tying back in somehow, but it doesn't. Like there's just no reason for it other than to like seem cool and different. Like I said, it was trying too hard to be too many different things at once. I don't want to say this in like a super mean way, but this was a very like I'm not like other books book. Like it was very, very much trying to be like I'm not like other books. Watch me have like 7 different formats and be extremely convoluted because no other book would ever be written like this. Like that's kind of the vibe it was giving me. I was like, please be like other books so that I can try and understand you a little bit more. This is a personal complaint that is not at all the book's fault, but more of a thing that I'm just tired of seeing because I've seen it so much, because it's just a really popular trope in media. And again, not the book's fault. This is just a thing I'm personally tired of reading about. I think I read and watched too many things about this recently. But this is just another book about a mid-20s woman who is mentally unwell and is coping by having a lot of sex. And like, that's fine. I don't mind that trope existing. It's just, I've seen it in so many things recently, like I said, because it's been so popular. And every like book about like an unhinged, quote unquote, unhinged main female character is always that same trope. And she's like not unhinged. She's just really going through it and doesn't know how to cope with anything. And they always have her cope with that through having a lot of sex. And again, that's fine. It's just the like main trope that exists right now. And I would just like something a little different. Again, not the book's fault, that's just like a personal complaint I have, since I feel like I see that everywhere now and I just want a little bit more variety, you know? That's all I'm asking for. And then I guess I would say my other main complaint about this, I would never categorize this as a romance book. It's a book like a love story, as the title says. I would say it's a love story because it is, but it's not a romance book. This is about 2 codependent people who are extremely impulsive and who are also going through a lot of emotional problems, a lot of mental health problems, and they are not coping with them well. In my opinion, more than anything, they were like obsessed with each other. I would consider it a study in what people can be like when they are really mentally unwell and find somebody else who might be in a similar place, and how they can become extremely codependent on that person. How sometimes that can lead to like true real feelings, true real bond with somebody, but how it can also be extremely unhealthy. I would never call this romantic. In my opinion, it's not really romantic. There are romantic moments more than anything. This is just a book about mental health. And I don't know, I feel like the way people talk about it doesn't really make it seem like that's what the book is about. I feel like people talk about it way more as if it's just like a love story, a romance book. And while that's obviously a main significant part of the whole story, it is about two codependent, emotionally unstable, just not okay people who are just really going through it. They're having a really hard time. Oh yeah, and there is one section that I won't even read for you. I will leave the quote on the screen because people love to say that this book has really beautiful writing. And yes, at times it does have beautiful writing. However, I will include this one quote because I feel like whenever people talk about how beautifully written this is, this should also be mentioned, because in my opinion, this was just so out of nowhere, so uncomfortable to read, and such weird phrasing. Why would you phrase it that way? It was giving fan fiction. It was, and not in the good way. So yeah, do with that information what you will, but I feel like if you're gonna talk about how beautiful the writing is, I feel like this also needs to be mentioned, because in my opinion, it's not very pretty. The format was very, very strange because there would be times where the book was just like regular like dialogue, where the characters would have dialogue back and forth with quotation marks, everything is normal. Then it would get switched up into this like Sally Rooney-esque thing where the quotation marks would just disappear, except it was beyond that. Like, we're just gonna like take the quotation marks away and then also just make it not technically dialogue. I don't know how to explain this. I can't find a section right now and I don't want to spoil anything for anybody if you wanted to read this, but essentially there would be times where there would be like legitimate dialogue, and then times when the dialogue would switch up into, he suggested that they should go get pizza. She suggested that that maybe wasn't the best idea. He looked at her. She looked back at him. She thought maybe this place down the street would be a good idea. He thought that that wasn't the best idea because they just ate there recently. Like, that's how they would do dialogue sometimes. Like, I don't know how to describe it in any other way. It's like it was third person dialogue. That, I don't know. It was so strange. And it would just switch up halfway through. Like halfway through a scene where we'd have regular just dialogue with quotation marks, it would just switch up into that all of a sudden, and then we'd switch back. Like, there was no reason. That's what I mean when I say the book was pretentious and it was just like trying to be different. And there was just no reason behind any of it. So it wasn't effective because like there has to be a reason why you're using a specific format to tell the story, you know? It has to be doing something effectively for the story in order for it to actually work, in order for there to be a need for it. But there was no need for any of the like unique formatting to the story because it didn't actually do anything, especially when you're using so many different formats all in one and just switching back and forth without any warning. It was so strange. And yeah, this book was just, it was a lot. At times I thought that that like formatting thing was just because the book was supposed to feel convoluted and heavy because of the emotions of the characters, so we're kind of trying to mirror that. And you could make that argument, but again, it was ineffective. In my opinion, there were scenes where it wasn't like intentional, like there was no reason to be switching back and forth that often. You could have stripped some of that back and it would have been far more effective. In this case, it was just trying to do everything all at one time and it just wasn't working. So yeah, those were my thoughts on Alone with You in the Ether. Again, I gave this like 2.75 to 3 stars. It was okay. I would not read it again. It didn't really have like a lasting impact on me. It's not the type of thing that I'm really gonna think about. There were some really beautiful lines in here. I did mark some stuff up that I liked and also some stuff I didn't like. More than anything, I really just came away from this book feeling like it was way too convoluted and was trying just too hard to be something new. But unfortunately for me, it kind of missed the mark. All right, so the next book that I read was Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. This is another kind of gothic fantasy, a little bit of gothic romance book. I picked this up honestly because I liked the title. I thought Nettle and Bone sounded really cool, and I had heard people talk about T. Kingfisher before, but I'd never read any of their books, and so I was curious to see what I would think, and I enjoyed this. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I thought it was mostly just like okay, but if you are looking for like a gothic fantasy book, that's another book that's like girl has has to go on some kind of like adventure or mission to save her family, and she teams up with this group of people, has a little romance in the meantime as well, and we have some like gothic horror-ish elements thrown in there. You might enjoy this. That's pretty much what the book is about, and I think that it does what it sets out to do pretty effectively. However, personally, I just didn't like really connect with it or really love it the way I did with some of the other books that I read in the same kind of vein. So yeah, I thought it was mostly just like, okay. I don't really have many thoughts about it. I don't have a lot to say about it, but I did like the Bone Dog. Bone Dog was very cute. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about, but Bone Dog was very cute, and I want my own Bone Dog because he's adorable. Then the next book that I read is a book that is extremely popular right now that everyone has been talking about, and that is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. If you've been on the internet at all, you know what this book is. Everyone's been reading it, everyone's been talking about it. I finally read it and I loved it. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. This is Jeanette McCurdy's memoir. If you happen to not know about her relationship with her abusive mother and her time as a child actor and a child star, and how she dealt with like extremely severe eating disorders her entire life. So it was an extremely hard book to read. Like, it was really hard. There were parts of this that made me feel like truly sick, parts of this that like I just don't ever want to think about again, but it made me extremely emotional. It made me cry at times, and like I said, was very difficult to get through. However, I truly think this is one of the best memoirs I've ever read. Just honestly, one of the best books I've read this year, and I think it's the type of thing that I wouldn't say everyone should read because, again, it's really hard to read. So definitely look up content warnings if you choose to read it. Obviously, the subject matter is really heavy. However, it was so impactful and so emotional, and she was just so brave for telling her story the way that she did, and I'm very excited to see where this takes her, and I'm very happy for her and all the success that she's had with this book because she deserves it. Absolutely, all of it. After everything she's been through, she truly deserves it. All right, so the next book that I read was Tales from the Cafe by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This is the second book in the Tales from the Cafe series, or not Tales from the Cafe, Before the Coffee Gets Cold series, which I read earlier this year, and I loved that book. So these are just basically some more stories from that same coffee shop, that same world. I didn't love this one. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. I thought it was just okay compared to the first one. The first one I gave like 4.5 to 5 out of 5 stars. I loved it. This one kind of just felt like more of the same. Personally, I didn't find the stories in this one to be as impactful as the stories in the first one. So yeah, I am glad I read it. I did enjoy it. And if you like the first one, I think you'll still like these. But in my opinion, this didn't even really necessarily need to exist. So yeah, I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. Did enjoy it, but the first one is definitely where it's at. But there you all have it. That is it for all of the books that I read this summer. Like I said, I was so happy with my reading. I loved so many of these, and I cannot wait to continue reading into the fall and read so many cozy fantasy, gothic, horror novels, because as I said, that is what I'm in the mood for. I've read like 75 books or so far this year, and I'm very close to like 100. I hope I hit 100. No pressure on myself, but that would be very cool. And yeah, I'm just excited to continue having a good reading year. So let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of the books that I mentioned in this video. I'd love to discuss your thoughts on any of them. And also let me know what the best book that you read was this summer. If you would like to follow me on any of my social media, all of my links are in the description box as always. But thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!